The standoff over Greenland may have subsided for now, but a week of threats by Donald Trump has made one thing clear. Europe, as well as Canada, can no longer rely on the United States for protection. And this statement about allied troops in the Afghanistan war has caused absolute outrage among NATO countries.
We've never needed them. We have never really asked anything of them. You know, they'll say they sent some troops to Afghanistan or this or that. And they did. They stayed a little back, a little off the front lines. But we've been very good to Europe and to many other countries. And, you know, now under my administration, that began because we had a very successful first term. That began then, but it has to be a two-way street.
So that was Donald Trump saying non-American NATO troops in Afghanistan stayed off the front line. Now, that is an outright lie. 457 British troops lost their lives in Afghanistan. 44 Danes died. Now, that was the highest per capita casualty rate among coalition forces, and their reward, threats by Trump to take their territory. So, Trump is no friend to Europe. That could not be clearer. We already knew that. What to do about it, though? Well, that's not so simple. Patrick Porter is a professor of international security at the University of Birmingham. He's the author of How to Survive a Hostile World, Power, Politics, and the Case for Realism. And I spoke to him earlier and asked how Europe should respond to Trump's new world order.
I think the first thing they need to do is to work from the world as it is, not the world as they want it to be. The world that they want to be is the world of the 90s, of more or less stable hierarchy in the world, led by this superpower, which dominated in three key theaters, which is the more or less benign security provider in this part of the North Atlantic. And unfortunately, what they've been doing a lot is trying to find ways of persuading an increasingly reluctant, resentful, and now predatory United States to do some version of the status quo. And the status quo is collapsing at some way in some tempo we're not sure of, but things will never be the same. So what I argue, or what my friend and colleague Dave Blagden argues with me, is the main thing they should do, amongst a lot of very hard options, and this is not an easy option, is to accept the premise of what America actually demands, which is that Europe takes the lead for its own defense. But what's important here is that we need time. And time is not always generously provided by this White House. But this means entering the world of the hard-nosed world of a big bargain, at least attempting one. And that is, in exchange for time, Europe does what America does, but more slowly in an orderly, negotiated, phased way, so that America can not leave Europe entirely, right? Have a less American Europe, not a post-American Europe, but with a coalition of NATO, Europe, and other states taking most of the burden, but over a longer period rather than the chaos that we're now going through. Sorry, it's a very long answer.
From having read your article and your answer there, you're sort of taking a middle ground, aren't you? So there are people who are saying that Europe right now should go for autonomy because obviously Trump is no longer an ally. They need to go it alone. And then there are people saying an independent Europe is impossible. Trump might be difficult to work with, but there really is no other game in town. And you're saying in the very short term, there probably is no other game in town. But in the medium to long term, Europe needs to build up its own self-defenses so it's not as reliant on the United States.
Yeah, that's right. And that's also conditioned by the fact that we've got this Eastern Front, which sometimes people don't mention enough when we're talking about Greenland, that we're also dealing with Russia. If you believe, and not everyone does believe this, but if you believe that Europe should continue to help Ukraine push back and stay in the fight and check Russian expansionism, then there's a real danger of ending up in a two-front scenario, if you'll pardon the expression, where you're trying to deal with two things at the same time beyond your capacity. And if you get into that position, you fail because it's beyond your ability. So my sort of anxiety, our anxiety, is the limits on our current state of readiness and power. So what we need, and one of the most important material commodities in diplomacy, is time in order to build up. And it's not just military, right? It's about a whole lot of things. It's about resilience of supply chains. It's about infrastructure, all sorts of stuff. And the danger with let's just detach now approach is that it presupposes a level of strength that we either don't have or which is just latent, not actual. The problem with the let's just bandwagon, the other extreme, is that you then put yourselves in the hands of the predator and hope for their mercy. I mean, it's a bit dramatic, but that's the danger.
I mean, I have seen people argue that maybe Europe has more cards than it is, I suppose, willing to use, or sort of that it's being open about. So I've heard people sort of suggest kicking out all of US air bases because, Trump likes to suggest he doesn't need Europe, but obviously Europe is very helpful for the US in terms of world power projection because it's got air bases here and on Cyprus and the like. People also suggesting clamping down on US tech companies. There are lots of these tech CEOs who are very close to Donald Trump. If we were to sort of go nuclear and say, we're not going to allow Instagram and Facebook and Google or whatever, obviously there's a problem about alternatives, but that's a question you might answer as well. Other people suggesting we could sell US treasuries. So we've got all of this US government debt. If we put that on the market, that could damage the dollar. So why could we not go more aggressive in the here and now?
Well, we really could. I mean, those really are possible things, and that would threaten the United States with tremendous damage. I wouldn't say that's not something we could do, but it really is, as you say, going economically nuclear. One of the problems here is that the United States and Europe can drive each other into great economic disaster and right quick. And it's one of those things where you can imagine that chess game, but you have to imagine it more than one move at a time, because it would almost certainly provoke equal and greater retaliation and this kind of game of chicken. We can't be sure that America wouldn't try and dominate the escalation there and shut Britain out of its entire market, cancel all sorts of areas where we are dependent on their tech or on their military technical assistance, all sorts of things. And it would be happening at the very same time that we are dealing with many, many very fraught, complicated problems at home and with trying to contain Russia. And I think all of that mix would just be too much for us. If for nothing else, it would be too much for our bandwidth. As you know, probably better than I do from the conversations you've had, governments can only do so much at any given time. More than one or two profound crises can just overwhelm them. There was a moment last year, or 2 years ago, under Joe Biden, when his envoys spoke to their Chinese counterparts at a summit, and they actually said at one point, look, our hands are full with Ukraine, with Gaza, with domestic turmoil. Could you please go easy on Taiwan? That's the situation you can get into if your commitments exceed your power, and that's why we wrote the article.
So it seems like a strange thing to reveal to the Chinese if you're saying, please don't go for Taiwan now because this is when we'd be really weak and wouldn't be able to deter you.
I'm making it slightly more dramatic than it was, but it would be great to, if we were going to get into this crisis, to get from a much stronger position, like the Europe of the 19th century, say, in terms of relative power. I'm not nostalgic for Europe of the 19th century, but to have that level of relative power. But we don't. It comes, unfortunately, it's like the old joke in the taxi driver in Belfast, and someone says, how do I get to the post office? He goes, not from here, mate. So we're in that position now. And I think whatever we do should build in a clear-eyed recognition of that weakness, but ultimately with a view to building up strength so that we don't remain wards of a predatory superpower.
I mean, we're talking about sort of Europe in general here, but in terms of dependence on the United States, it's a matter of degrees, isn't it? So France has sort of historically made a decision to be more sovereign when it comes to their military. Their nuclear deterrent is genuinely independent. Britain has generally made a decision to be much more subservient to the United States. Our Trident system only works if they give this. If they agree with it, basically. I mean, I'm not in a rush for us to use our nuclear weapon, but so much of our military is completely dependent on the United States in a way that, say, France isn't. Could you talk about why it was that the UK in particular made that decision to, I suppose, decide that genuine sovereignty was too expensive? Was that the decision that was made?
That's partly it, yes. I mean, I would just say, I think you're right on the fundamental that the survival of the Trident system depends upon American logistical support. Britain could operate it independently, but if it did operate independently, it would still need to replenish. So ultimately, it is a vulnerable situation. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's partly a calculation about the trade-off between sovereignty and expense. It's partly the desire at the time to have access to the cutting-edge technological sort of superpower. And I think at the same time, paradoxically, part of the rationale for Trident in the first place was to exert transatlantic influence, given that shortly after World War II, America was being highly coercive against Britain. This is something that's often forgotten. And that, as Nye Bevan said, we've got to get one of those things over here, get a Union Jack on it, partly in order to put a limit on coercion. Unfortunately, beyond blowing things up and exerting a deterrence against the ultimate violence, it's not always easy to use them to influence anything. They have more of an ultimate value rather than a kind of day-to-day diplomatic value.
In your article, you're basically arguing, I think, that we need to increase defense spending so that we can defend ourselves and we're not completely reliant on the United States, which is now an unreliable superpower or an unreliable ally. I suppose the other argument would be to say maybe we should have a more humble role in the world, right? Because at the moment we have a military which is built to be able to exert force across the entire globe. We have 2 aircraft carriers, right? China only has 3, and this is a sort of superpower which is sort of ordinates of magnitude more important than us. So could we not say we should reorientate what we mean when we talk about Britain's defense system? But could that not just be saying we don't actually necessarily have to spend more on it? We just have to bring back our outpost in the Indian Ocean or whatever and focus on actually defending Britain, not exerting power anywhere and everywhere?
Well, indeed. I mean, the ultimate aim is not to increase or decrease spending. It's to make our power effective and concentrated so that it can work for the national interest and work for the people of the country. And in that sense, I agree with you. I mean, there was a great debate a few years ago now, a prehistoric debate about the integrated review under the Johnson government, where there was a big argument between the so-called Indo-Pacific tilt faction and those of us who are on the much more continentalist faction, who wanted to bring forces much more localized, to bring them to bear in the theatre that is both our neighborhood and the place where we can exert most influence, as opposed to dissipating strength across the world. Now, we lost, my faction lost that fight, even though I don't think we lost the argument. And I think that would be part of a program of rebalancing our capabilities in line with the interests. That will get us probably only so far, though. At some point, there's going to need to be some more resource, but I'm quite realistic about that. We're probably not going to get to 5% of GDP. If for no other reason than there are limits on public opinion, public willingness to carry that argument. One of the difficulties here is that we don't have the absolute clarity of, say, Joseph Stalin with 150 Soviet divisions parked on the lawn. It's that people are frightened, but not so frightened as to be willing to have a radical readjustment of domestic priorities. So while I would argue for some increase, I would also argue, as you've suggested, for a concentration in the region. I would also argue for the real importance of informal coalitions, that if we can't max out defense spending as much as we might want, what we can do is prepare to work much more effectively with our neighbours. And that means actually independently of US oversight. And I'm not even talking about creating new institutions or the European Union. I'm talking about coalitions within NATO and beyond NATO Europe that are serious about operating, like Finland, like Poland is a really important part of this conversation, by the way. We sometimes talk too much about France and Germany. I'm much more of an Easterner in that sense. So there are a whole lot of things to do to make ourselves less reliant and stronger. And it's not even so much that America's unreliable. That, I mean, in a sense, all great powers can in principle be unreliable if they're capricious and if they don't agree with you. It's that they've become predatory. That's the fear, that we're making ourselves dependent on a power that might turn upon us overnight. And a number of us have said for a long time that even people you think are the greatest friends in the world can turn on you capriciously. People used to laugh about that. They're not laughing anymore.
You're a defense analyst. So sort of when you talk about public opinion, you say sort of that's a limit to how strong the military could be because people aren't necessarily that scared. And I suppose, I'm a political analyst and I look at it sort of from a different perspective. And I kind of don't want the public to be more scared. And I'm not convinced they need to be. And I suppose someone might be watching this thinking, look, yes, I can see there's a war in Ukraine. I can see the US is predatory, so it would be, good to be more independent from them. But there's lots of competing priorities. There's climate change. There's an aging population. There's all these different things we could focus our time, resources, energy on. You talked about bandwidth earlier. And us as this island, Britain, no one is seriously going to invade us. I think the idea that Putin wants to go for Ukraine and then the rest of Europe seems a bit far-fetched to me. So what's the case for our military genuinely being a priority when, as far as I can tell, there isn't anyone that's going to invade us?
Great point. Great question. Thanks for asking. Well, one of the reasons no one's going to seriously invade us is that it would be damn violent if they did. I mean, there are retaliatory consequences to that, or at least we can raise the doubt for it. That there's nothing built into the laws of nature that says no one's going to invade you, or that even that no one's going to try and overrun Europe. These things take real effort and with long lead times in advance, and they take investment and sacrificing some things that we'd like to consume. So, but secondly, more importantly than that, I think that there's more to one's security than just literally not being wiped out by an invader. I mean, the balance of power on the continent matters for who sets the agenda. If you can imagine, for example, a Europe with Vladimir Putin's forces unchecked, becoming bolder in taking some more territory and then starting to dictate terms, and above all, looking successful, looking like the future. Can you imagine how much that would further poison British politics? So there are all sorts of ways in which it's desirable to keep those things in check. Now, you're absolutely right. There are a whole lot of things people want to invest in, and they can't be wished away. That's one of the reasons I say we need to look to coalitions as well to divide the labour as optimally as possible. But there is a danger in assuming, as some people do, that things like GDP on paper and will kind of make sure that we're okay. I mean, the country with the largest GDP in the world for a long time in the 19th century was China. And look what the European powers did to that. And that's one of the things China remembers. So, but let me be very clear. I'm not advocating a kind of full octane scare campaign. Let's drive everyone into a state of terror. And in fact, one of the reasons we make the argument we do is to avoid getting to that by starting earlier in a kind of making a rational case, which I think you could actually build a case for amongst the British people. I'm not so cynical as to think that people just have to be terrified. But I think they can be alerted to risks and to be persuaded to act, as indeed they did during the pandemic.
Do you think it's sort of a problem for legitimacy of our military that it hasn't really been associated with defence? So when I think of what have been the big outlays of the British Army over the past 2 decades, well, more than 2 decades actually, a disastrous war in Iraq, getting involved in Libya, taking out Gaddafi, then you've got a civil war. When I think the US Army is going to get more powerful, it's going to get more money, what if it just does more of those things? Why should I trust the British Army to be in the business of defense as opposed to attack, I suppose?
Well, indeed. And that's why we, in a healthy, robust democracy, we should hold to account those who made those imprudent decisions. And I mean, it's not just a matter for the army, although what we do need is a military that's willing to answer back, not to disobey orders, but to give good, robust advice, which it doesn't always do. There's too much of a culture of saying yes, but it's not just a matter for the military, it's a matter for the quality of statecraft we have. But you are absolutely right that an increased military doesn't necessarily increase your security if you use it imprudently, if you use it wrongly. But that does not cancel out the equal and opposite danger of being under-equipped, undersupplied, and suddenly being at the mercy of the Donald Trumps or the Vladimir Putins. So there's no door that says, enter here, no risks. There are always risks to be balanced. And that's one of the reasons why we need people holding our leaders to the fire, as it were.
I shouldn't have implied that it was a mistake of the British military to invade Iraq, but I suppose it's the stronger the military is, the more options the government has. And if you don't trust the government to use those options, well, it's a bit like surveillance, isn't it? Obviously, to abuse surveillance, that's a decision a government makes, but the more surveillance powers they have, the more likely they are to abuse them. And I suppose you could think a similar thing about military power.
I think that's right. I guess de facto, if one takes the position, I don't trust the state to use the military prudently, I'd like to keep the military much more limited, much smaller. What you're effectively doing without necessarily wanting to is trusting other governments to use their militaries well in relation to you. So there's always bastards out there who might misuse their militaries, but they might be using them against you, if you see what I mean.
Is it time to sort of switch the superpower that we ally ourselves with? Because lots of people are looking at China now and saying China is a much more consistent, reliable state. I mean, China's not really an ally of ours at the moment, but in terms of its political system, in terms of how it's dealing with the world, it's not China that's throwing sanctions on even its enemies, let alone its allies. It's not China that is kidnapping sovereign heads of state in foreign countries and doing regime change in different continents. So I suppose instead of making all of these big investments in having an independent sovereign military, I mean, clearly we need to do some of that, right? We're not going to sort of dissolve our military. So I'm not arguing that. But could we not hedge our bets and say maybe we should shack up with the Chinese? Because clearly they're going to be able to offer us some perks if we go into bed with them, I would imagine.
Yes, and in the article we mentioned that option, as it were, balancing against US overreach by aligning to some degree with China. Of course, there are many degrees of embrace one can have, as I think you've just said. I think that could be one of those things that's a cure worse than the disease. That it is true that at the moment, China's diplomacy, partly this is an indictment of Trump, looks more orderly and stable. But if you're making Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party over the past 10 years look orderly and stable, you really are running wild. I mean, annexing disputed territories in the East and South China Sea, subjugating Hong Kong in the dead of night, abusing trade relationships, for example, to do massive IP theft. Now, I'm not getting all pompous and sort of morally denouncing it. I'm just saying it's a dangerous thing to be in bed with if you are in bed with it, because it comes at a price. At one point, I think a Chinese envoy said to their Australian counterpart, if you want favourable market relations with the People's Republic, you can have them, but you have to silence criticism of us in your private media. So there's a kind of tributary hierarchical approach that also can be quite predatory. And that may well have consequences like things like surveillance, things like the terms of trade, etc. It's true that if the US were to be even worse governed and to become more predatory, that might become more of a tempting option, especially now that Starmer has kind of have such a rapprochement with Beijing and with this gigantic embassy and all of those things. But I don't really look at the world and see America and China. I see powers. And I see the powers that can very quickly become mischievous and predatory if they have too much of a whip hand.
As it currently stands, I would say, the subjugation of Hong Kong, that was historically part of China until the Brits took it sort of at the end of the barrel of a gun. And I'm not saying they did it the right way, but I'm saying it's different from the Americans taking out a sovereign head of state, because there was a legal basis for China to have Hong Kong and then integrate it within their country. And then obviously these islands in the South China Sea, that's in their neighborhood. So I do see the Americans at the moment, and not actually just with Trump, as a power that is more aggressive on the international stage beyond its region. Let's talk about what happened this week. So your article in the New Statesman was actually before, I suppose, the update on Greenland. And actually, I say the update because we still don't really know what it was. Trump has backed down from sanctions because he reached some kind of agreement with Mark Rutte, who is the General Secretary of NATO. As far as I know, we still don't know what was in that agreement. So could you first sort of explain what your understanding or predictions are about what was agreed?
As Manuel says in Fawlty Towers, I know nothing or almost nothing about it so far, except for this kind of vague indication that there's some increased US basing rights, some minerals arrangement, and some ongoing discussion about US forces there. But I honestly couldn't tell you more than that at this point. I'm embarrassed to say. It's all very opaque. It has all the makings of, and you might agree with this, has all the makings of a leader who's trying to save face while realising he wants to back down, but trying to present it as a deal, a favourable deal that he's coerced out of the feckless Europeans, as a little bit in the manner of the way he did it with NATO in his first term, where they kind of agreed to significant defence increases so that he could get off the horse of threatening to leave NATO. And my worry is, I am glad for the world and for Greenland and for Denmark and for us and for America that there does seem to have been some climb down. My worry, though, is that the climb down will induce a false sense of security again. I think, oh, we're back to normal. Trump always chickens out. We can go back to business as usual. We can go back to the same old stuff. I think, well, what if next time the Americans are bolder? And what if the very fact that they did climb down makes them more aggressive next time?
This is always the thing in international relations, isn't it? Where you're sort of judging, well, they backed down last time, so they'll back down next time. But the alternative interpretation is they say, well, we backed down last time, but we definitely cannot back down again. So there's this ambiguity, and people, I suppose, tend to believe what they want to be true. Sort of as lots of the realists, so you're from the realist school, and lots of the people I've been sort of listening to from the realist school seem to, compared to, more liberal-minded people, think that the possibility of Trump getting Greenland is actually a lot more realistic than people are bargaining for. Are you in that camp where you think that actually, Europe is in a relatively weak position, might does, to a large degree, make right in this world, and if Trump really wants Greenland, he will get it?
I think it is possible for America, if it really wanted to, just to grab it. Very crudely, the question is at what cost? What happens next? As I've argued sort of elsewhere, realism has a very dark, corrupt cousin, what I call Machtpolitik. So where realism counsels taking power seriously, accepting the world as it is, but also some kind of self-restraint and some prudence. Machtpolitik is this much more hubristic sort of sense of imperial hubris that takes delight in power, that loves power, doesn't just accept it reluctantly, and it is committed to being gratuitous and rubbing people's nose in it and humiliating others, and loves pyrotechnic displays of violence. These two things are not unrelated, and this is a danger for all realists that we can fall into that. It's like sort of putting on the ring in Tolkien. Trump, I think, is very much of the Machtpolitik school, that there's this kind of frivolous but very deadly exhilaration in displays of power and violence. When it comes to Greenland, I mean, one of the problems here is that the original agreement with Denmark in 1951, in fact, allows for America to surge forces in there at will, just about. I mean, it's actually a very permissive agreement, and making Trump's whole behavior recently quite unnecessary. If America wanted to beef up its forces in Greenland, as it used to have thousands of troops there, it could very quickly do that. And so therefore it also follows that it could actually quickly take it by overmatch, and Europe would find itself overmatched quite quickly. But then you would get into the trade, tech, economic consequences. And that may have been what the Europeans presented to Trump behind closed doors at Davos. As someone said the other day, it's the only good Davos meeting ever.
I mean, it was definitely the most entertaining Davos meeting I've ever witnessed. Well, entertaining, sort of dramatic. Let's say dramatic. Entertaining is maybe to underplay the significance of what happened. Finally, I know I always apologise for doing this. When it happens that I say finally, then ask a very big question, which is we're clearly moving into a much more multipolar world, and many people will, to some degree, celebrate sort of America, not being able to do anything anywhere, and then claim that was just and right, and that was the rules-based order just working its magic, right? There was a level of impunity and hypocrisy to American foreign policy that I think we'll be glad to see the back of, if it does indeed sort of go. I mean, Mark Carney suggesting that the middle powers won't pretend anymore, so that would be a start. Obviously, the alternative to a unipolar world is a bipolar one or a multipolar one. Two visions of a multipolar one. One, it sort of balances the powers. It gives those middle powers a bit more leverage because they can play the superpowers off each other. The other is that, the only thing worse than having a dominant mafia gang is having two mafia gangs sort of fighting each other for territory. So is a multipolar world more peaceful or more dangerous than a unipolar one?
I think for all of the hubris and excess and abuse that can come with a unipolar world, where a colossus starts thinking it's special and starts thinking it's cracked the codes of history, as Ming China did, as America has done, as the Romans started to do, all of that is priced into my answer. But a multipolar one is more dangerously war-prone because the pecking order is less clear. There are many, many, as it were, dogs at the bowl, and they're not all entirely clear who's the strongest. And that level of instability and power shift and fear and insecurity, that is historically more prone to the largest wars. So in that sense, we're comparing one poison with another. But if I had to choose, I would rather the relative stable hierarchy than the more unstable lack of hierarchy. But what's really important is we begin with the reality, as you said, that it is becoming more multipolar. Let's accept that and work with it and make the least bad deal possible and be as secure as we can. That's the thing. What's happening is that a lot of people are still just lost in their nostalgia for a period they imagined very romantically, which is what they call a rules-based order, which was in fact still a world of power.